Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Here is my summary of a 10th anniversary report on some selected survivors of the Columbine High School massacre. This report, of course, is now outdated by 10 years because today, on April the 20th, 2019, 20 years have come to pass since that massacre. The author of this article is or was Elizabeth Day, and obviously no copyright infringement is intended, only public enlightenment about this event. 10 years on, and Columbine still feels the pain. On April the 20th, 1999, two students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, walked into Columbine High School with pipe bombs and semi-automatic weapons and carried out one of the worst massacres in US history. We went back to hear the remarkable stories of survivors who 10 years on still suffer terribly from the emotional and physical fallout of that spring day. Published on Sunday, April the 12th, 2009. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold carrying a semi-automatic pistol were pictured in the cafeteria at Columbine High School by the security camera. Columbine High School is located near Littleton in Jefferson County, Denver metropolitan region in Colorado, Western United States, during their April the 20th, 1999 shooting rampage, where they killed a teacher and 12 students before committing suicide. This footage was already late in the massacre. I think the approximate local time was 11:57 a.m. They had only 11 minutes to live before they committed suicide jointly, apparently by shouting in unison 1, 2, 3, and then shooting themselves in the head. Photographed by AP. At 16, Craig Scott was too young to know much about death. When he heard a popping noise outside the school library one sunny April morning, he thought it was a student prank or joke. Nothing more sinister than the snap and fizzle of a firecracker set off against tarmac. It took him 24 hours to discover that one of those popping sounds was a gunshot that killed his 17-year-old sister, Rachel. 10 years later, he's still reliving it. My life changed that day, says Craig. The hard part is going through it in my mind over and over again. It was just after 11:20 a.m., of course, the local time, on April the 20th, 1999, at Columbine High School, Colorado, and Craig Scott was about to become part of the deadliest high school shooting in American history. Rachel was the first victim. In the ensuing 45 minutes, Eric Harris, 18, and Dylan Klebold, 17, would stalk the corridors of their school, shooting down classmates, lobbing homemade pipe bombs through doorways, and wreaking their own particular brand of indiscriminate carnage with an arsenal of semi-automatic weaponry. They killed 12 students and a teacher before turning the guns on themselves, although, of course, it must be noted that the teacher actually bled slowly to death early that afternoon. In the years that followed, Columbine would become a shorthand for a school massacre. Those searching for an answer would variously blame lax gun controls, violent video games, and in the case of one local evangelical minister, Satan himself. Those who survived would never be quite the same again. It was only when a female teacher, she was a part-time visual arts teacher, Patty Nielsen, ran into the library screaming at everyone to hide under the tables that Craig began to get scared. He hunkered down underneath the desk with his two friends, Matthew and Isaiah, one of the school's few African-American students, Isaiah Schultz. Matthew was Kechter, by his school name. Kechter indicates the possibility that he was at least partly of German origin. Then Harris and Klebold burst into the library wielding a 9mm semi-automatic carbine, 2 sawn-off shotguns, and a handgun. They were shouting profanities, mocking students like they were in a movie or something, recalls Craig. They laughed. They had fun doing it. They came over to my friend Isaiah and began to make racial slurs towards him. That was the last thing he heard before they shot him. He pauses. And the last thing he said was, "I want to see my mom." Then they shot Matthew dead. Craig, miraculously uninjured, was left sandwiched between the 2 slumped corpses of his friends, their blood pumping onto his sweatshirt. "I was experiencing so much fear I thought my heart was going to stop beating," he said. Across the room, Valine Schnurr, who had turned 18 6 days before, was cowering beneath another table with her best friend Lauren Townsend. They had just been preparing an English presentation on the American Civil War novel, Cold Mountain, and their pencil cases were still on the desk above their heads. Valine remembers Lauren holding her hand tightly. Then, without understanding why, Valine felt her body jerk forcefully. She noticed she was bleeding and would find out subsequently that she had been shot 9 times at close range. "The force of the bullets pushed me out from under the table," says Valine. "I was in excruciating pain. It feels like fire running through your body. I was saying, oh my God, and one of them, Klebold, asked me if I believed in God. I said yes. He asked why. I said, my parents brought me up that way." Then she held her breath and closed her eyes, hoping he would leave her to die. The gunman walked away. "I didn't see his face," Valine says, "but their voices, it was like they were happy. To them, it was like playing a game." It was only afterwards, when she nudged her friend so they could make their escape, she realized Lauren was dead. The 9th bullet had sliced through Valine's shoulder and killed her. The bloodshed in the library was a single component of a much broader destruction. Harris and Klebold had plotted their rampage with meticulous brutality over the course of the previous years, spewing forth expletive-laden rants in their personal journals and on videos, and especially Harris excelled in that. That were deemed so incendiary, the police would later refuse to release them to the public. However, at least one segment has been released where both boys pretending to be really angry make threats, murderous threats, on live camera. Wearing black trench coats and wraparound sunglasses, Harris and Klebold shot at teenagers eating lunch in the school grounds, at students in the cafeteria and the library, at teachers running through corridors, at the police snipers who tried to stop them, and finally fatally shot themselves. Craig Scott managed to escape the library and run home. Valine Schnurr was taken to hospital by ambulance with life-threatening wounds to her chest and abdomen. Astonishingly, she was discharged within a week. There are some who would have you believe that these survivors are the lucky ones, the students who made it home to their parents that evening, who walked out of Columbine with their lives more or less intact. But 10 years on, it is these people who bear the brunt of remembrance, who struggle with the fragmented horror of that single day. It is noticeable in the small details. You can see it when Craig recounts his story in a blank monotone, eyes slanting downwards. Focusing on some indistinct point on the floor. Or when Valine admits that she no longer wears sleeveless tops or bathing suits because she does not want to reveal the livid scars on her arms. Or when Christy Moore-Bacher, a 16-year-old Columbine High School junior in April 1999, has a recurring nightmare about crawling along the floor of the school auditorium, fleeing an unnamed sinister presence. Or when big strapping men like former fire chief Chuck Burdick talk about what happened that day with cracked voices and trembling hands and the shimmer of tears in their eyes. Burdick, who coordinated the emergency responses operations chief of the Littleton Fire Department, had never seen anything like it. The scale of the disaster was overwhelming. At one point, there were 250 students unaccounted for. Eyewitness reports of 6 to 8 shooters and a telephone network jammed by a 2,000% increase in the average call volume. There were helicopters, ambulances, and TV crews as far as the eye could see. 4 ad hoc triage areas were set up in the school grounds. As injured students ran out of the building into nearby front lawns and garages, people came out of their houses to help them, mopping up blood with old t-shirts and towels. A decade on, and talk of closure and getting over it is anathema to these people. Yes, they survived, but survival was not a question of forgetting. It was choosing how best to live with remembering. Columbine was not the first campus shooting, nor despite its awful repercussions was it the most lethal. That would happen 8 years later at Virginia Tech, where that mentally sick Korean-American student, I can't remember his name now, shot 32 people dead, including one teacher, if I remember correctly, before then turning his gun on himself. And then he posted a very vicious and angry video in the middle of the shootings, claiming that he had basically been cornered and had no choice but to act this way, which of course proved the profundity of his mental illness, which sadly was not detected early enough. And because of privacy laws, the fact that he had had emotional problems and had been treated for them at his previous school or schools was not reported to the authorities at the Virginia Tech University or college. 3 years earlier, Thomas Hamilton walked into Dunblane Primary School in Scotland, United Kingdom, and opened fire, killing 16 children, one teacher and himself. And as I said, in 2007, a 23-year-old Virginia Tech undergraduate killed 32 people with 2 semi-automatic weapons before committing suicide. But Columbine was different. It was the first high school shooting to be played out in real time, which was probably one of the reasons why the perpetrators chose to do that. They were fascinated with these destructive films, especially natural-born killers. And they wanted to be remembered as killers, supposedly brave killers, carrying out what they, in their depraved minds, called natural selection. So supposedly the people whom they killed did not deserve to live, never mind the fact that they killed themselves. Despite the fact that Eric Harris, the bolder of the two, boasted that they were actually godlike, not even exactly human. In front of 24-hour TV news cameras and on the internet, it left behind a trail of distressing imagery, including the shadowy CCTV footage of the gunmen stalking the cafeteria and the videos, diaries, and web pages they left behind outlining their visceral hatred for almost anything or anyone who crossed their path. Country music, Star Wars fans, Christians, high school jocks, even people who mispronounced espresso. So claiming that they just randomly shot at any students who were moving on their path simply is not true. They had some specific people whom they targeted, and one of them was actually their first victim, an outspoken but gentle-minded and compassionate Christian, Rachel Scott, who had already for some time had probably planted into her mind by God the foreshadow that she would die early. And just under 1 year prior to the shootings, on or around May the 2nd, 1998, she had posted this, or written this reflective entry in her journal. This will be my last year, Lord. I have got or gotten what I can. Thank you. Rachel Scott had also openly witnessed to them about Jesus Christ, wishing that they would be persuaded to give their lives to Jesus Christ. Sadly, neither one of them did. Mobile phones were just beginning to be widely used. If they had been more widely used, and if at least a few or some students had realized that the massacre was going to take place, then hopefully at least one of them could have phoned the authorities already earlier. Patty Nielsen did what she could. She was able to run to the run to the library where most of the deadly shootings took place. She yelled at the students there to get under the table, and she called 911 and kept the line open. Miraculously, she was not discovered, although at least one of the killers came close to the desk under which she was hiding. Some children called TV or radio stations from within the building, leading one news anchor to implore them to turn any television sets off or down at least. It was, according to Mark Obmaschik, who covered the tragedy as a reporter for the Denver Post, a precursor to reality TV. Guess who is now the US president, one of the earlier stars of reality TV from the program The Deal. You are fired! People found it hard to deal with because of the immediacy of it. It was also different because of its magnitude. Harris and Klebold wanted to outdo Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma bomber, who had almost exactly to the day 4 years earlier killed over 60 or over 70 people in that federal building in Oklahoma City, and who would be executed in the first years of the 21st century because of it. And he died unrepentant of his act. Very sad. They had planned meticulously for over a year. The only reason the devastation was not far greater was because they used the wrong kind of alarm clocks for their homemade bombs. The tickers were plastic, not brass, and therefore incapable of making the necessary electronic connection. And I would say there was the hand of God. God spared tens or even hundreds of lives that would otherwise have been lost. And when we ask, where is God when disasters like these strike? I'm reminded of the wise words of evangelist Anne Graham Lotz in the wake of the 9/11 attacks in 2001, about 2.5 years after Columbine. And she said that basically in the United States, and this would of course apply to many other countries around the world, especially the Western ones, meaning in addition to the United States, Canada, the European countries, Australia, and New Zealand, and various countries even outside the Western world, that basically we have been for years telling God to get out of our lives, out of our schools, governments, churches. I'm not sure if she used churches, but her point was that people who blame God for not sparing more lives or all lives when disasters strike, under the normal safe course of things, don't care about God and don't want to listen to him, let alone obey or follow him. Something to think about for all of us. Those are the nightmares I have, says Burdick, who is now a senior consultant for the public safety firm IXP Corporation. If those bombs had gone off, I know for sure I would have had hundreds of people dead in there. They weren't setting out to be a school shooting. They were setting out to make a name for themselves. There was the inevitable search for blame. Unable to bring the two perpetrators to justice because they had committed suicide, the United States launched itself into a vigorous debate on gun control, on the influence of violent video games and films. Craig Scott remembers Harris and Klebold quoting lines from Natural Born Killers as they shot their victims, and on the segregated nature of US high schools, meaning that there are still high schools that are generally speaking white, although of course there are Hispanic students as well who can be of any race, and then there are still too many schools that are mostly filled with African American students. Despite the desegregation efforts, including busing that became so controversial and notorious in the 1970s, because that meant that in the worst case scenario that students had to travel up to maybe even 100 kilometers, at the very least up to 50 or 60 kilometers in the worst case scenario, so that racially balanced schools could somehow be established. And one way, by the way. There were endless attempts to seek an explanation. Why had no one spotted the shooter's murderous intent earlier? How could Harris and Klebold, both of whom had a secure and stable upbringing, at least outwardly, have found it in themselves to unleash such devastation? Were they unreachable psychopaths? At least Eric Harris, for all his high grades at school, seems to have been profoundly troubled emotionally. And most pressingly of all, could it happen again? Well, unfortunately, it could. As recently as in February 2018, over 10 students were killed tragically and ironically enough on Valentine's Day at a high school in Parkland, Florida. And some of those notably unsensitive or desensitive right-wing conspiracy theorists even declared that some of the interviewed survivors of the Parkland high school shootings were in fact supposedly crisis actors. No, they were not. And that young woman who killed herself either in March or earlier this April 2019 because of survivors' guilt was definitely not a crisis actor. But some of these conspiracy theories have to come up with even the most bizarre conspiracy theories, such as the bizarre theory according to which Jews or Muslims set off the recent fire of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. They have to do that because otherwise some of them would have to go and find a new job. Fortunately, one of them, Alex Jones, was charged in 2018 for a gross abuse of the media freedom. And hopefully that will make some of those conspiracy theorists more cautious and more decent and more willing to find out what really happened. The truth often is either more mundane or more complicated, and then more question-filled this side of eternity than these dramatic and, I will admit, fascinating and entertaining conspiracy theories. In various cases, they are fascinating and entertaining on the surface. In various cases, there are also distortions of the truth. As a result, Columbine left an indelible bruise on the national consciousness. It spawned two films: Michael Moore's 2002 documentary on gun control in the United States, Bowling for America, and Gus Van Sant's Elephant, a 2003 account of a fictional high school shooting. In the same year, Columbine also provided the inspiration for Lionel Shriver's award-winning novel, We Need to Talk About Kevin. Until 1999, Columbine had been a quiet community of 100,000 situated at the foot of the Rocky Mountains. It remains typical of American suburbia, a scattering of carefully landscaped parkland surrounded by four-lane highways and malls selling donuts and pizza slices. The mushroom beige houses are built in an imitation frontier style with outside decking. 10 years ago, because this article was written in April 2009, it was a good neighborhood, but one where people mostly kept themselves to themselves. The bad stuff: family quarrels, truanting, children, meaning children who are absent from school for illegitimate reasons, divorcing parents tended to be swept behind the picket fences. Columbine was a nice place held together by shared aspirations. After the shootings, however, the community was under media siege and its grieving played out in public. Then every subsequent April, the TV cameras would come back with weary familiarity. The locals got used to speaking about what happened. At first, they might have been resentful at the intrusion, but today, if you ask someone about the shooting, the response is generally a tired look, a sad nod of the head, and the admission that yes, they knew some people there that day. Ted Zockel-Halter was on a business trip in Seattle when he got a call on his colleague's mobile phone telling him that there had been a shooting at the high school. His two children, Anne-Marie, 17, and Nathan, 15, were Columbine pupils. He bought a ticket for the first plane back. The captain came out to sit next to him. He said, "We are going to go as fast as we can," recalls Ted, who was at the time of the interview 59, so now probably 69. The wings are literally going to start flapping, and when we get to Denver, we're going to drop like a stone. And that was what happened. We got there half an hour early. Nathan had survived. Anne-Marie was in a critical condition, having been shot by Harris in the back and chest while she was eating lunch outside. It was finally mild enough to eat lunch outside the school that April day. One of the bullets had cut through her spinal cord. The only way the attending doctor could staunch the bleeding was to put his finger in her spleen like a bottle stopper. No one thought she would make it. According to her stepmother, Catherine, her wounds were so severe that the doctors cut her open like a cadaver, meaning a body or a corpse, as if they were doing a cause of death operation. When Ted got there, Anne-Marie was on life support. Anne-Marie did recover, but she was left paralyzed from the waist down. She spent 3 months in physical therapy and underwent surgery to remove the bullet from her lower back and drain fluid from her heart. Then 6 months after Columbine, her mother, Carla, who had a history of depression, went into a pawn shop, bought a gun, and shot herself. Ted found himself in a depressive stupor, unable to function beyond the minimal day-to-day existence, relying on the goodwill of neighbors to cook meals and clean the house. In the end, he had to move away from Columbine to remove himself from the stifling good intentions, the sympathetic new glances, and constant questions. He bought a house 8,420 feet up in the mountains, surrounded by 35 acres of pine forest. He chopped down trees for 12-hour stretches, making firewood that he would then give away. Slowly, he came to accept the past. In 2002, he married Catherine, who had been his grief counselor. Nathan joined the Navy for 5 years. Anne-Marie became the manager of a nearby bath and beauty store, and Ted is now, or was at the time of the interview, a school safety activist who trains parents in the best way to respond to a crisis. There is Craig Scott, who runs his own film production company, and by the way, in 2016, I'm Not Ashamed, a partly dramatized documentary film about his late sister Rachel, and produced by a Christian film company, was released, and it at least has been available on YouTube. I would encourage you to watch it if you can. And also works for Rachel's Challenge, a charity set up by his father in honor of his murdered sister to provide educational programs to encourage school children to be kinder and more understanding. There is Valine Schnur, who now works for the social services, arranging adoptions and helping to rescue traumatized children from abusive parents. And then there is Ted Zockel-Halter up on the mountainside, chopping up tree trunks for firewood and giving it all away. Today, Columbine High School remains at the bottom of a gently curved hill, a squat beige construction of concrete and green-tinted glass. The library and the cafeteria have been rebuilt. Behind the main building above the playing fields and basketball courts, there now stands a memorial to the victims of what was at the time the worst high school shooting in American history. The names of the dead are carved into panels of granite. Survivor stories: Christy Morbacher, at the time of the interview 26, so now 36, was a 16-year-old junior at Columbine on the day of the shooting. She and her 15-year-old twin siblings, Dan and Kim, all escaped unharmed. At the time of the interview, she was studying print and broadcast journalism at the University of Colorado. She was sitting in a math class when the fire alarms went off. At first, they didn't get up to go or to leave the classroom because they thought it was a student prank. Then one of the teachers came screaming down the hallway and we got out of the school. No one knew what was going on. There were all sorts of rumors flying around. I ended up at a friend's house, and it wasn't until we watched the news on TV that we found out what was happening. I realize now how much I observed everything. I remember thinking that the Friday before the shooting, I had been worried about going to prom, about my dress, and about being a terrible dancer. The next Friday was totally different. It changed a lot of my priorities. My parents have stuff they'll never get over. My father is not a particularly emotional guy, but he couldn't cope with not knowing how to help us that day. My mother still feels guilty for having 3 children who came back. Ted Zocco-Halter, whose 17-year-old daughter Anne-Marie was left paralyzed from the waist down. I summarize his statement. I struggle with an explanation for what happened. If you're of sane mind, it's very hard to be able to understand what would motivate anyone, let alone children, to do something so self-destructive. Another one of the struggles was that because the shooters killed themselves, there was no one to bring to justice. I very seldom think about Eric and Dylan. I think more about their parents than them. We will be living with this for the rest of our lives, so we need to do something positive about it. And then Daryl Scott, who has been a pastor and who was married to the deceased student, Rachel Scott's mother. Unfortunately, they got divorced in the late 1980s, but remained friends. And since then, he has remarried. His wife is called Sandy Scott. I'm not good with the how do you feel questions. There are no words. It's more important to honor Rachel's life than talk about her death. Rachel had a very outgoing personality. She was beautiful both physically and spiritually. I have 5 children and 3 stepchildren, and Rachel was the middle child. She was like a spark plug in our family, mischievous and bubbly. Through simple acts of kindness, she reached out to children who were bullied or teased and disabled. That's why we set up Rachel's challenge to follow her example. It has given me a sense of purpose. Would I have prevented it if I could have? Absolutely. At the same time, you come to accept that Rachel's life was what it was. We have learned a lot in the past 10 years. 12 million people have heard her story in live settings. If you could subtract Rachel's death from the equation, it's been 10 of the most fulfilling years you can experience, but of course, you can't. And then Chuck Burdick, who was there within 4 minutes of the initial call. The biggest problem was the size of it. There were 40 to 45 different law enforcement agencies there and almost 2,000 emergency workers. There were 54 ambulances on the scene, 3 helicopters, and about 250 students unaccounted for. That's what we were dealing with. When the SWAT teams went in, they faced an intense, loud, obnoxious environment. There was smoke and haze, strobe lights from the fire alarms. They had to weave in and out of explosives, stepping over backpacks in case they contained bombs. All the doors in the school had locked automatically, so they had to break through 240 doors. before they could get into classrooms. So one of the explanations for why they were so slow to reach the classroom, where unfortunately the heroic teacher David Sanders slowly bled to death by 3 p.m. that afternoon. Where Columbine was different was that Klebold and Harris weren't setting out to be a school shooting, they were setting out to make a name for themselves. Harris was the leader, he was probably a psychopath, and if this hadn't happened, then he would have gone on to something else. Klebold maybe went along for the ride. When I got home at the end of the day, my family were standing at the top of the stairs waiting to embrace me. They had seen it all on TV. Yeah, I was crying. It was very powerful, very emotional. We didn't realize then the impact it would have. I went back to the school a week later and it was totally bizarre. There was still a plate of nachos in the cafeteria. I'd never seen anything like it. It was something just frozen in time. It was very eerie. The incident wasn't that bad to cope with. It was what happened in the aftermath, with everyone second-guessing the decisions we made when we had only a fraction of a second to make them. It definitely speeded up my retirement. Mark Obmaschik, 47, was part of the team that reported the shootings for the Denver Post. The newspaper later won a Pulitzer Prize for its coverage. I remember the first calls coming in and we threw the whole newsroom at it. To begin with, there were conflicting reports. No one knew who the killers were. Then we heard it was children killing children. A couple of stories stuck with me. One child, Daniel Mauser, ended up in the library because he had no one to have lunch with and he got killed. It didn't make any sense. Why would they want to get even with him? Well, maybe because he was so smart. He got straight A's, as did, incidentally, one of the killers, Eric Harris. But contrary to Eric Harris, Daniel Mauser was a kind-hearted boy who never wanted to harm anyone. According to a newspaper or Time magazine article about the slain students, and of course that slain teacher, David Sanders, Daniel Mauser decided to overcome his shyness, and that's why he enrolled in the school's debating team. He also decided to enroll in the school's cross-country running team in order to push himself physically. So he was a young man who definitely wanted to challenge himself, despite still being only 15 years old. Winning the Pulitzer was hard because there was no joy in this story. We did our jobs while other people had horrible grief. So how the tragedy unfolded. At 11:10 local time, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold arrived separately at Columbine High School. At 11:15, they took bags stuffed with homemade bombs into the cafeteria. They were set to explode at 11:17, but fortunately they did not. At 11:20, all times, of course, the local times, dressed in black trench coats, they began to shoot at students eating lunch outside, and Rachel Scott was the first student to be killed. Richard Castaldo, her friend, or one of her friends, was the first student to be wounded, and that seriously. However, he survived. At 11:24, in the cafeteria, sports coach, as well as business and computer science teacher David Sanders, heard the gunfire and ordered students to evacuate. At 11:27, Harris and Klebold walked into the school corridors firing shots. One of the bullets, sadly, tragically hit Sanders. At 11:29, they walked into the library where they ended up killing 10 people. At 11:35, they shot their last victim. The last victim who would not survive. And at 12:08 p.m., they, after shouting in unison, 1, 2, 3, killed themselves by shooting themselves in the head. On April the 22nd, 1999, an unexploded bomb with the power to kill hundreds was found in the school's kitchen. Aftermath, there have been numerous U.S. school shootings since Columbine, including the shootings at Northern Illinois University in 2008, and the 2007 Virginia Tech Massacre, in which Soon Hui Cho, a 23-year-old South Korean American student, killed 32 people. Written by Natalie Woolman, and this article was published by the British Guardian newspaper. No copyright infringement intended, only public enlightenment here on YouTube.